You know, it's often said that history is stranger than fiction. However, I think this might be something of an understatement if we consider that, far too often anyway, history is practically indistinguishable from fiction, and what we're left with in our modern history texts is only marginally superior to the folk tales of old passed down generation to generation orally, and in which all context is practically lost to us, and it becomes virtually impossible to understand historical figures as characters when we meet them as caricatures first, and consequently we tend to have a rather monochromatic, categorical, and very narrow-minded, one-sided view of history and certain figures from history, and it becomes very easy to assail and misjudge events without real access to the true context of the nature of the times and the nature of events. And far, far too many unfortunate people and places and events get lost in this, between the pages of time, as it were, and fall victim to the dubious judgment and jaws of history, or of historians anyway. And yeah, this happens this far, far too often. And I'd like to do my small part to, I suppose, resurrect the good name, or at least attempt to give a more balanced judgment of a few events from history, and a few characters as well. And I'd like to start with one of the most seminal events, perhaps the most seminal event of the last millennium, the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution is generally divided into a couple periods. The first being what is normally referred to as, the early period or the moderate period, roughly 1789 to 1791, 92, thereabouts, obviously beginning with the Tennis Court Oath, the fall of the Bastille, culminating in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and all of those events and occurrences which are generally held to be noble and egalitarian and worth preserving. But somewhere along the line, things get a little hazy and a little complicated, and we end up with the so-called Radical period, highlighted by the Terror, in particular Maximilien Robespierre, which eventually leads us to the through many events, but ultimately culminating in the more or less reign of new Emperor Napoleon. But in between those first two periods, there's a lot of transformation of the nation and a lot of key necessary facts which aren't made very clear much of the time, and they need to be made painfully clear, lest we lose focus and pass these absurd judgments which just have no place in the context of the times. And we need to start with an understanding of what the Terror was and why we don't need to be categorically condemning it until we understand what exactly it was. The Terror is not, as occurred during the French Revolution, has little to do with our modern understanding of terrorism. This was a systematic government, a very rational, necessary response to wars both within and without, and these had cropped up rather incessantly over the course of the revolution and had to be dealt with, else they would have swallowed the revolution whole and reverted it back to its regressive absolutist past that they'd tried so hard to free themselves from. But the Terror, one of the first signposts of the Terror, and this is a good place to start as far as defending relatively unpopular actions. One of the first signposts of the Terror, one of the most, I guess it would be horrifying to most people, understandably, is something known as the September Massacres. These occurred in September 1792. Now, in order to understand the September Massacres properly, it's probably a good idea to backtrack approximately a year to 1791, the summer of 1791, to the Declaration of Pillnitz, which was made by the monarchs of Prussia and Austria, respectively, essentially forewarning of the storm to come, saying that if any further infringements were made on the liberty of Louis XVI, there was going to be hell to pay. That it was a call for all European powers to invade France. collectively and restore Louis to his proper place as an absolute monarch. And so, preceding all this declaration, Louis himself had attempted to escape. He'd been made a constitutional monarch over the egalitarian evolution of the revolution of the course of the previous 2 years, beginning in 1789, but by the summer of 1791, he'd become quite unhappy with his position as mere constitutional monarch and no more absolute overlord of his people, and he had attempted to flee. And according to the letters he and his wife were writing, it was quite clear that the implications were quite clear that he intended to return at the head of an Austrian or Prussian army and crush his own people under his own boot and force them back to submission to his absolutism. So he was captured and he was returned back to his palace, still allowed to retain his constitutional powers, his powers as constitutional monarch and head of state with veto power and everything. And around this time, the Declaration of Pillnitz was made against the revolutionaries, saying, "Don't you dare attempt to extract any retribution on this king, or there will be hell to pay, and or there will be stern retribution from the monarchs of Europe and the crowned heads of Europe." And this is probably a good thing to keep in mind.